Okay, we're getting underway for this session. Before we start our one-on-one discussion and our panel, we've got a special message from former Treasurer of New South Wales, Matt Kean. I bumped into Matt in the street the other day at the pub, and he's very excited about his new role as the Director of the Regulatory Affairs and Strategic Partnerships at Wallamai Capital, which he's had for a while. But he's also got a brand new role in climate. And it's very exciting that he's here, well, not here, but giving us a video, it's not exciting, it's boring and tedious that he gave us a video. It didn't make his way here to Canberra, a town which he needs to learn to love. Well, hopefully this gets back to him and he'll make his way back here. All right. It's very nice that he took the time to make this video for us. So let's hear from Matt Kean.
I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Thank you to the event organisers for the opportunity to participate, and please accept my apologies for not being able to join you in person. As the newly minted chair of the Climate Change Authority, I'm pleased to be able to continue working in pursuit of a cleaner planet. I've dedicated the past 5 years of my working life to that challenge. I might have a new mandate, one that's strictly above the political fray, but my commitment to the cause remains as strong as ever. And I'll be guided by the same principles: a faith in science, evidence, engineering and economics, not ideology. A belief that the economic case for reducing our emissions is just as compelling as the environmental case, and an understanding that the power of collaboration is essential to taking responsibility and decisive action on climate change. The Better Future Forum's focus on unifying governments, industry and the community expresses a similar sentiment. We have a shared understanding of the task before us. The planet is warming and the forecasts of climate scientists are sadly coming true. We have national and global emission reduction goals we have to meet, and coal-fired power stations are exiting the system as they come to the end of their economic life. So we need to get on with the task of building an energy system powered by renewables. It's the most affordable solution available to us. It supports decarbonisation, but it also supports households and businesses dependent on reliable, low-cost clean energy. The Authority's Sector Pathways Review will strengthen and achieve those objectives. The Landmark Report is backed by best-in-class modelling and informed by good ideas from across the industry and the community and governments. The review will help to unlock the next wave of investment, technology and innovation needed to smooth Australia's transition to net zero. The 6 sectors identified in the report, electricity and energy, transport, industry and waste, agriculture and land, resources and the built environment, are integral to our national wealth. They have varying emissions profiles. Some sectors will be harder to abate than others, and the solutions for each will need to be different. The review identifies the spectrum of mature, demonstrated and early-stage technologies that can best assist in each sector. Our roadmap will ensure that they don't just survive, but thrive in a low-carbon economy, supporting secure, well-paid jobs and regional renewal. The review places a premium on eliminating obstacles that stymie progress. It provides a blueprint for legislative, regulatory and policy solutions that can drive change, and I hope that it helps inform the net zero plan being developed by the Australian government. We also want to give investors the comfort that they need to back technologies essential to the energy transition. By doing so, we can position Australia to become a renewable energy superpower and supply the world with the technology, fuels, goods and services in increasing demand. Products like green hydrogen, green steel, green aluminium and green data centres have the currency of a low-carbon economy. Our country has all the resources needed to succeed. We have an abundance of the sun and the wind required to help deliver cheap, clean and reliable energy. We're rich in critical minerals. We have skilled workers and we are a nation of entrepreneurs. I'm confident that the review and the ongoing work of the Authority will help leverage our natural advantages to both protect the environment and strengthen our economy. And I look forward to working with you all on this journey. Thank you so much and enjoy the day.
Thank you, Matt Kean. Matt Kean, probably the only Liberal to have a picture of JFK and Barack Obama on his office wall. That video sets us up for a great conversation in a second with our panel. But before that, we're going to have a bit of a one-on-one conversation, tying in some of the similar themes that we just heard from this morning with Luke Menzel and Baethan Mullen. Luke is the CEO of the Energy Efficiency Council, Australia's peak body for energy efficiency and demand response. He plays a key role in supporting businesses and households to decarbonise and drives policy on efficiency and electrification. Luke also serves as Vice President of the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council and co-chair of the Australian-Germany Energy Efficiency Sub-Working Group. And he's also got a podcast, like all white men of a certain age. So it's great. It's great. It's just sum it up. Let me sum it up. You can get that wherever you get good podcasts. Hasn't won any awards for best comedy podcast though. Not like me, 4 in a row. But hey, whatever. He's going to be talking with Baethan Mullen. Baethan is the CEO of the Superpower Institute, a think tank dedicated to unlocking Australia's potential in global decarbonisation. With over 20 years of experience in public policy, regulation and economics, Baethan leads research and analysis aimed at shaping welfare-enhancing policies of a prosperous, low-carbon future. And Baethan just told me off mic that Baethan, which is an Irish name, is Irish for foolish. But there's nothing foolish about this conversation that's going to be happening right now. So please take it away, Luke.
Thank you so much. Clear that you're a regular listener to the Let Me Sum Up podcast. Your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy, and we're gunning for you, mate. Don't worry about that. I've also been told you're sticking around to make sure that I'm staying on time. The timer is going right now on the interview I'm supposed to be having with Baethan. I'm wondering if that's got something to do with the 90-minute plus runtime on my podcast, whether that struck fear into the conference organisers. So Baethan, we better get you up here. Baethan Mullen, CEO of the Superpower Institute. Round of applause, everybody. So, there's been a lot of lofty words spoken about the clean energy superpower thing today. I want to get your take on that because, as I understand it, it's your personal job to make this happen as the newly minted CEO of the Superpower Institute. So, but first tell me what the Superpower Institute is, who its audience is and what you're trying to achieve.
Thanks, Luke, and thanks for having me here, and thanks to the organisers for putting together a great program. So, as you've heard from others this morning, and I think Frank Yotso summed it up really well, we're singing from the same hymn sheet on these issues. Australia's really staring in the face an amazing opportunity here to extend economic prosperity in this country for many decades to come, and at the same time decarbonise not only Australia but make a significant contribution to decarbonising the industries of our trade partners. And so the Superpower Institute was founded by Rod Sims and Ross Garno to take up the role of producing research and analysis that is going to underpin that opportunity and to advocate for the changes that need to be made in Australia, particularly in a policy regulatory setting that will enable these opportunities and bring them to life. So Superpower Institute's an economic think tank where we're producing research and analysis and then going out and advocating for these changes.
You use that word opportunity and it gets thrown around a lot. It is a massive opportunity. I think anyone that's been around here for the last day and a half probably recognises that and has heard it once or twice. I think less discussed is the fact that we're not the only horse in this race, right? Like, there's other nations vying for clean energy superpowerdom. In fact, I noticed that even Keir Starmer in the recent UK election was claiming that the UK was going to be a clean energy superpower, which I think is a little bit of a long bow, but there you go. But, who else is vying for this role in the global economy?
Yeah, it's a great point because I think from some of the discussions you might get the impression that this is just inevitable and Australia will fall into this opportunity without much effort. That has been the case in the past with Australia's efforts or the way Australia has benefited from other booms, the mining boom, the gold rush, things like that. But this is really going to take a lot of work to set up. There are countries around the world trying to do similar things and indeed have policy settings in place that are going to support these kinds of industries, and they are out ahead of us at the moment, so we do need to catch up. You think of the likes of Brazil, the second biggest iron ore producer. They're doing work to promote a green iron industry. The US with their IRA has a lot of industry support for things like this. And then we have obviously China, who not only a massive customer of ours for iron ore and coal and other things, but has its own iron ore deposits and is very ambitious with its green energy rollout. And then you have the Middle East, who has abundant gas resources, and they are looking to produce import iron ore, process it using gas, which is very cheap in the Middle East, and then export it to other places. And so that's a competitor for what we want to do here with renewable energy.
So we've got natural advantages. I think Frank Yotso sort of talked about the competitive and comparative advantages that Australia has, but it's by no means assured that we come out on top, and there's a bunch of stuff that we need to do to get this done. You mentioned China. At the moment, as you say, the massive exporter of iron ore to China, there's a lot of processing happening at that end of the supply chain. Part of this vision is making sure a lot of that processing happens here. How's China feeling about this idea?
I'd love to know how they're feeling about it. I can't say we exactly know, but I do think, to your point, one of the other big things that needs to happen here is Australia's diplomatic effort and our trade relationship effort with our trade partners. Obviously, the benefit we have with China is our existing relationship is quite strong. We obviously they're a massive trade partner for Australia. We export products to them already. They're very comfortable with that relationship. This should be viewed by both us and them as an extension of that relationship. It's bringing that trade relationship into a new era. We're helping them achieve their goals. China has a net zero target. They will have to find ways to achieve that target. And eventually, despite China's very ambitious rollout of renewable energy, they are going to run into constraints, and they're going to need to look elsewhere for support to be able to decarbonise and to achieve their net zero target. And Australia, therefore, becomes an obvious target from a kind of principled point of view, but there's definitely work for us to do in demonstrating that we are a reliable source of the products that they're going to need. And so those initial investments that will help get these industries off the ground, that's what hasn't happened yet and what needs to happen. They are going to demonstrate to our trade partners that these opportunities are real and that they can rely on them, and that Australia is going to be a partner that they can lean on for decades to come.
So the point you just made about, I guess, all the demands for clean energy within the Chinese economy, I understand that you're doing some work at the Superpower Institute, some research, which is kind of looking at some of our trade partners, looking at some of the constraints they're going to face, and kind of like laying out the logic of why Australia could decarbonise in a collaborative way by leveraging our strengths and helping them deal with some of those constraints. Is that right? Yeah,
that's right. And I think we've heard a lot about the superpower opportunities over the last day here at this conference and elsewhere. What's clear, and a lot of the work has been focused on, is that this opportunity makes a lot of sense for Australia, and that's why we're interested and why we're going to commit to it. But the need to convince others of that, and to show that Australia is that reliable partner, is the next step. So the research that we're doing is not only demonstrating that Australia is that source of production of these products for our trade partners, but we're also undertaking research to demonstrate that the economies around, in particular Asia, but also in Europe, their ambitions to achieve net zero, to decarbonise, to electrify their economies, to produce enough renewable energy to power their homes, their transport, their businesses, they are going to run into significant constraints. And our analysis will show that if they want to continue on to have the kinds of industries that they currently have, steel making, aluminium production, things like that, they will need to look elsewhere to import the renewable energy from elsewhere. And as you've heard from others, importing renewable energy extremely expensive in contrast to things like coal and gas. So we need to find ways to embody that energy in products that are easily transportable.
One of the other things that came up in the panel this morning was the need to pick some areas and lean into them and not try and do everything. Like, just because it's green doesn't mean it's a great place to invest taxpayer dollars. And, spreading ourselves too thin also means that we can't actually scale up the necessary investments in particular areas. But that obviously opens up a pretty vexed question about which horses you back in this race. Are you doing any thinking about, unpacking that idea that came up around independent advice and kind of dispassionate analysis of comparative advantage and the kind of advice that gets provided to governments and how we can set those sorts of frameworks up?
Yeah, definitely, Luke. I think we come at this from a starting point that government's role should be in places where Australia enjoys comparative advantages. And clearly in this instance, that's our abundant capacity for renewable energy and also our mineral deposits. If you look to other potential industries that Australia could invest in that might be green, but where Australia doesn't enjoy a comparative advantage, that's where we could get into trouble. That's where the long-term viability of those industries would be very challenging, and government money might well go to waste. I would say that the work that's been done on this already, the Treasury National Interest Framework, is a really great document, and we think is a really excellent framework for thinking about these ideas. But some of these are also going to be evolving as we learn more, as we do more research. We're going to find out about where Australia has advantages over other countries and where we may well need to let these things go and let others take the opportunity and fill the void.
You mentioned the need for pretty proactive diplomatic effort for this collaborative decarbonisation, which I think is just a term I made up just then. I don't know that anyone's using that term, but Frank, you're welcome to it if that's helpful. Those bilateral relationships, which gives us, I mean, you talk about us investing to so we give confidence to our trading partners that we're going to be there when they need us. But it also goes the other way, right? We've got to have the confidence that we're going to have demand that justifies those investments. So what's the process whereby we build those bridges and ensure that we have the clarity around the demand with some of those trading partners that allows us to scale up the supply?
Yeah, part of it is what we touched on earlier. It's demonstrating the how those economies are going to evolve in terms of their energy needs and their capacity to serve those needs. And the other side to it, I guess, is there's this something of a chicken and egg problem here. Our customers want to see that Australia is capable of delivering, and we can't expect them to invest until we can demonstrate that. But at the same time, it's very hard to make investments in Australia and build industries when you don't have that customer base there ready to go and committed. And so those early investments, those industries and the firms that are at the frontier here are going to need government support to get those early plants in place, because it will have that demonstrator effect to others that this is possible. This is something we're doing, we're committed to, it's going to be here for decades to come. And that's going to unlock that kind of chain reaction of our trade partners seeing what's possible and us demonstrating to them that we can do it.
All right, so there was a pretty significant commitment in this broad space in the May budget. A lot of that was tied up with production credits for clean hydrogen and for critical minerals. Like, for you to sort of realise some of these opportunities that you're talking about today, what are the next steps that a government would need to take to kind of give those trading partners that confidence?
Yeah, I really firstly would applaud those steps. I think they're really important and necessary to get the ball rolling here. I think the way we look at this is that those kinds of industry supports are really surrogates at this stage for a carbon price. And in the long term, others have spoken about this morning, in order for this to work, we do need effective systems of carbon pricing, not only in Australia, but around the world.
I just love that Ross got religion on carbon pricing some 3 decades ago, and he's just still banging away at it. He's not going to let it go. And good on him.
Stay tuned for his forthcoming book on the same topic. So that's the key one, really. Is the way you've got to think about this is take steel, for example. It's extremely polluting to produce steel. It accounts for around 10% of global emissions at the moment. If we are going to decarbonise steel, the efforts that we're talking about here in producing green iron, it is going to take those polluting industries paying a price for the emissions that they cause, and over the long term, that's what we need. So that's the core to it. The production tax credits are an excellent step. We'd like to see more in that space. We'd like to see some capital grant support for the early projects that, as I said, will start to demonstrate what's possible here. And then the role for government in supporting the critical infrastructure in the regions where this opportunity is most likely, in the Pilbara, in parts of South Australia and Queensland, where there's not currently the electricity transmission, the storage, the transport options that are going to be necessary to support these industries. Government has a role there. And then we've already talked about the diplomacy effort as well. That's the other role for government here.
Final question. Has your comms team yet pitched you on a sort of a Clark Kent style social media stunt where you actually have like the Superpower suit under the shirt and you just rip it off?
Has been done. I'm at this stage refusing to wear my underpants on the outside of my pants.
Mate, if you were a long-standing CEO of this organisation, I guarantee it's going to happen eventually. Resistance is useless. Put your hands together for Baethan Mullen. All right. Well, with that, we're segueing seamlessly into our discussion of sectoral decarbonisation plans, because obviously clean energy superpowerdom is exciting, but there's a bit of work to do between now and then. The Energy Efficiency Council, the organisation that I lead, was a big advocate, along with a bunch of others, for the idea that we do sectoral decarbonisation plans. It wasn't a commitment of the federal government when they went into the election. It's something they committed to subsequently after a lot of us got in their ear and explained why this was so important, because so much of the debate over the last decade has been focused at this sort of 50,000-foot view, and it's kind of been this comic book death battle between coal and renewables. There's so much detailed work to do in every sector of the economy. We really need to work our way through that in a more focused way. What I didn't quite think about was that my organisation kind of works across all these sectors. So all of a sudden I just created like 6 parallel consultation processes that me and my policy team have to engage with, but it's all to the good. So I was thinking about, I've got some fantastic panellists, so I was thinking about reading out their bios, but it doesn't really matter in a sense. And if you want to sort of engage with, the why these people are bringing all their wonderful expertise to the table today, you can go and read that on the website. But I thought, what's another way I could frame this? And my mind went back to the 80s. And does anyone remember the Care Bear TV show and franchise? It's making a bit of a comeback. And I'm going to nominate myself as the efficiency and electrification Care Bear. So if you're trying to sort of place anyone as we work our way through this conversation, just remember imagine the symbol on everyone's tummy, and then you'll be able to work out who they are. It's not Funshine Bear. It's not Bedtime Bear. I've got Heidi Lee, CEO of Beyond Zero Emissions, who is our industry decarbonisation Blair. Please put your hands together for Heidi Lee. Jorge Chapa from the Green Building Council of Australia, which is our building decarbonisation bear. Jorge just revealed that he's also Grumpy Bear, which, as a long-standing friend of Jorge, I can confirm. You are probably Funshine Bear, Heidi, when I think about it.
Maybe like bipolar bear.
Bipolar Bear. Somehow that didn't make the cut for the franchise, but there's still time. Let's see. We've got our land sector bear, Kate Andrews, CEO of NRM Regions Australia. A round of applause for Kate. And our a public servant, so I'm sure he's delighted to be described as a Care Bear, Andrew Morgan from the Department of Infrastructure and Transport, who is the lead on the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, currently under development. Put your hands together for Andrew. So having just put my entire panel offside by describing them as Care Bears, Heidi, we've heard a lot about, this great vision for a clean energy superpowered and all these great industries we're going to build. One thing that makes me slightly nervous whenever we have that conversation is that we balance it with another conversation, which is the industries that we already have and building a bridge for those industries. And that's one of the key focuses of the sectoral decarbonisation plans. From what you've seen from the great work that's come out of the Climate Change Authority last week, the work that you're doing at BZE in that space, how are you thinking about that task and the kind of actions we need to move through over the next 5 or 10 years to make sure we do that part of industrial decarbonisation?
Thank you, Luke. I really think you missed a beat. We could have been Power Rangers.
Oh, well.
What?
Really but they're just colours.
Yeah, combined with
our powers combined, we've got this
we're starting
sorted.
again. Can we just get down there?
So Beyond Zero Emissions, we're an independent think tank. We look at really practical solutions to being able to deliver on this fast, fair, prosperous future. And I thought I'd do a little tour back up around why we think some of the things in the sector decarbonisation plans are awesome and where we think there might be some opportunities to improve. So who here has contributed to Beyond Zero Emissions before? Got a few. Now, the reason I ask that is because our superpower is actually that we have an enormous volunteer program, and so many of our research projects are actually citizen science-based models. It means that we're actually engaging with people across all different types of professions and sectors of work, from people running factories, people who are still at uni, who are developing a profession, people in government, people in industry, investment, and all over the place. And the solutions that we publish are co-created with expertise from people who are doing this in their day job, led by an expert team of staff members, mostly back in Melbourne, but now, pretty much a few down the eastern seaboard, which is exciting. So 10 years ago, we pretty much finished our sector-by-sector decarbonisation plans for Australia. And since then, we've really been looking at how they get implemented. And that's really where everyone lives somewhere that's going to be incredibly impacted by the shift to renewable energy, by the change in the way that we run our industries. This is where they really start to call bullshit on all those great ideas that you come up with in a sector-by-sector decarbonisation plan that takes that helicopter view of what's possible. So over the last 10 years, we've worked on decarbonisation solutions for places as narrow as Port Augusta, Collie, the Northern Territory, the Hunter Valley, Central Queensland, and a few smaller projects in between. Where the sector plans win is where they're talking about those place-based decarbonisation solutions. And I think that came through in many of the different solutions things. The reason that works, and the reason that it works for industry, is because this is how we protect existing industries, not in a put all your barricades up and make sure nothing gets through kind of way, but actually in how we see the challenges that they face as shared opportunities, not just for that industry, that facility. We really are talking facility level when we talk about place-based decarbonisation, but how that if those industries are going to stay in Australia, they have to be zero emissions and they have to decarbonise faster than any policy is going to make them, because they're the largest ones, are exposed to global forces. They depend on foreign investment primarily to be able to set up and stay onshore. So that decision is pretty much out of our hands. If we want those industries to stay, we have to be an attractive place. We need to be able to provide affordable, reliable, renewable energy at a volume, at a scale, at a quantum that they actually need. So that decision to keep those industries means building out enormous amounts of renewable energy anyway. For marginal extra, you get to support an entire ecosystem, that supply chain around them that's making the clean technologies and the other parts of the solution that make that industry viable, but also provide diversity for Australia's economy and for our regions as well. This is how we capitalise on skilled workforces. It's not just a one-for-one, let's go from one big industry to another big industry. This is actually about taking those big ideas and actually bringing that entire supply chain along with us. So I might leave it with that's where the big opportunity is, and we can come back to ways we might augment it.
Because I was talking with Baethan about the need to create demand from our trading partners for the things we want to export. But there's a similar dynamic in terms of spinning up like the clean energy infrastructure that we need, particularly things like hydrogen. Like you need people to use it, and probably the most plausible candidates for using it in the first instance, that early demand, I'm positing, you can tell me if I'm right or wrong, is industries that already exist and helping them to transition. Is that fair?
I think it's fair to say that a lot of the demand for the clean commodities can be met firstly locally. I think that Australia can provide a domestic kind of beta market for some of those bigger tests that we need to have. But just so we're all like working off the same page here, like you could decarbonise Australia without becoming a renewable energy superpower, and you could become a renewable energy superpower without decarbonising Australia. We actually need to do both these things at once, and that's where that place-by-place solution needs to kind of hit the ground. And we do need a big, bold economic plan that provides that long-term economic security, because it is also a national security issue. We need Australia to have a relevant and viable role in our global kind of mix and what comes next. It's not only about energy, it's about many other types of security as well. But domestically, you could keep going with our 1% of emissions. It's just that when you act on that, that's where you get the economic prosperity for locals as well. That's where we get that diversity of jobs. That's where we get nature protected. That's how we get clean air for people here in Australia. So we need to do both those things at once and make some really smart decisions now, not just about what project goes where, but when it gets built, so that we can have those twin goals.
Okay. I am going to go to you, Kate, because I see you nodding furiously. So the question that I want to ask is kind of like an ag question, which is around, I hear there's this red seaweed that that is coming, and it's going to solve all our problems in agriculture. And so we just need to focus on that. Is that a correct assessment of where we are in terms of agriculture sector decarbonisation based on your deep expertise in this space?
Are we all drinking the red cordial? Is that the question? So yes, I was nodding furiously with Heidi, and I'll come back around to some of that. But first of all, I should say, in my area, my sector, ag and land sector, I actually work in what's called natural resource management. So we work with all the people who live and work in the land to actually look after the environment, but also look after the industries that rely on it. So we work with traditional owners, pastoralists, governments, community groups, etc. So just so that you understand that context, so I've gone from the helicopter view that you talked about right down to it all happens somewhere, yeah? So it all happens in a paddock or in a landscape somewhere. So for me, the red cordial one's really interesting, and I was really relieved to hear Michael Battaglia this morning talk about the fact that it's not just tech innovation, and we all can get really overexcited about that. And it was good to see in the CCA report that they went beyond tech innovation. But Michael talked about, social innovation and market innovation. I guess I don't use that terminology exactly. And for me, and it goes back to the conversation you were just having with Baethan actually, which is that one too about what are the mechanisms and frameworks that we need in place between public and private sector and between civil society for us to actually enable this to happen for a just transition. And that's another thing I was nodding furiously at you about, Heidi, and also came up this morning with some great questions from the floor. So what needs to be in place for us to do that? And it's not just tech, because tech will just be transposed into existing systems that aren't going to give us or get us where we need to go. So understanding that we do need legislation and regulation as to help us with some of the drivers, for example, that will push us along. The policy settings, the program and investment, all really, really important. But I want to dig down a little bit deeper than that and say one of the things that we do that we think is so important is integrated planning. And that's something that gets left out of the mix. Not just planning forward for the future, but planning in space with people, like planning at a scale that actually works for people in the environment. So that might be the paddock and the trees in that, and where the transmission line is going to take out a grassy box woodland that's an endangered ecological community, or it might be at a higher level of a whole region where communities work together to say, actually, this bit, it's okay to go there. This bit, it's not, because we care about this bit. This bit's important to us. So that sort of proactive participatory planning at the right scale that gives people what they need, as well as looking after the environment, is a really key part of the mix when we talk about all the different factors, not just tech. Tech is a tool. Tech has to be used within these broader frameworks that must include planning. And next thing I did want to pick up on that with tech too is, let's be honest, guys, like, we all adopt tech when it's easy, when it doesn't conflict with, our existing values or lifestyles, when it's cheap, relatively, though it does surprise me what people pay for iPhones. All of that, there are all these factors about when we adopt tech and why we use tech. And this is really important for the land use change and practice change that we're going to need to seek out there in the majority of Australia. How's that actually going to happen well? And I was really pleased again this morning when we came up with this idea of not just giving people the chance to participate in determining this future, but people have to have informed participation. And even more than that, going back to the questions from the floor this morning, they must have agency. Yeah? And what does that look like? And I'm so sorry I couldn't be here yesterday, because it sounds like there was lots of that discussion happening. But we have to have agency for people and for the environment to be able to be at the table to help make those decisions. And that means good information. That means that capacity that Michael talked about this morning for people to participate. But it also means the decision-making structures need to be in place, that democratisation that needs to be in place. So that social governance area becomes a really significant part, and the tech bit sits within that, and we make those decisions around that tech and how it's applied. I'm sounding really evangelical, aren't I?
You are, and I'm going to balance that.
I just feel like I need to step back from the evangelical sort of cliff edge.
I'm going to be skeptical bear here for a moment.
Yeah, you do that.
So both Heidi might have something to say about this as well, but both of you are talking about, communities and people going on a huge journey in a short space of time. And this is one of the things that scares me about all of this stuff, is like, it is all plausible with enough time. But how do you go through that whole process of bringing all those communities along that journey in the kind of timeframes that we need to to keep a safe climate in reach, given that we've seen examples of this. You go too fast and you have that backlash. So I know you've got an answer. Are you going to contest the premise of the question, or take it away, Kate?
Yes, look, I get frustrated, and I think this was something funny where it was almost like people were contradicting themselves a bit this morning on this one, which was about let's not use last century systems to do this. But you know what? Let's, from first principles, actually look at what we do well in this country and not reinvent the wheel and build upon what we've got, God damn it. And it's not like land use pressures and competition is a new thing. Like, really? Like, we've actually been working on this stuff for centuries. And that's one of the things that we do in regional natural resource management. We help people manage land use planning and land use change and practice change and all those things. So look, communities have been engaged, and we have some fantastic, social infrastructure to actually engage in this and have been doing so. So it's not like, and this is where I think sometimes the transitional energy sector becomes evangelical, because they come along as if they're the first time. Guess what? This is your first time. It's not. You've just come in a different package. So I feel like we've actually got some fantastic systems in place. We've got existing work. So for us, it's only one part of the puzzle, but our regional natural resource management plans, the processes we work, the relationships we already have with land managers, there's a whole lot that we can work from. And my frustration, so I'll step back from being evangelical bear to cross bear, because you're grumpy bear, so I can't be grumpy bear.
Sorry.
Is please don't assume that there's a blank slate. Like, the number of people out there involved in the energy transition who don't understand that regional, rural, outback Australia, Indigenous Australia, have been working on these sorts of things for such a long time. And we have some really good systems and arrangements and plans and capacities and people. Yes, we need more support and help with that. But please don't think you have to come in and start from scratch on everyone's behalf.
I like that. I'm feeling slightly more hopeful. I think flipping the idea that, we've got to go out and educate the communities versus actually just the folk that are trying to build out all this infrastructure. How about you get educated about what's going on in those communities and plug into that?
Exactly. Heidi needs the mic. Heidi and I are going to get overexcited together now.
Just rest easy, folks. Rest easy. One of the things that we often hear when we go out and listen is that when we understand, when we share an understanding about why we need to make change, we just crack on with it. Like that's kind of a very, very Australian cultural thing. But I think we have, in response to your question about, this like regional Australia and this, collective, we're all treating it as though we're talking about our neighbour's 3-story house and we all have to have opinion about the planning approvals and stuff. This isn't about a massive educational campaign. It's about listening, and it's about getting on the same page about why we need to take action at all. Do we need the transmission line? Well, yeah, we do. Great. So let's stop debating if and start talking about how to do it well. And I think sometimes we get stuck in this like, oh, actually, we could just not have it, and maybe we could have some other maybe nuclear energy could come along in 20 years' time and fix the problems for us. And so we start creating this this ambiguity about what's up for debate and what's not, and what the consequences of inaction are, because we are very much about protecting things that we all care about.
But also good process, good participatory process, and this is done internationally. We know from that someone can accept a decision that is not the decision that they would have wanted if they feel there's been a just process that they've been participating in. Yeah.
And
so it's also
why.
Yeah. So it's more than why. There's the why, and then there's the actual how. And there's really good research and material around, how that process needs to run in order for that to happen. But also I want to push back. Like there is also a self-righteousness, dare I say, within the transition agenda about the willingness for other people to accept the impact and for the environment to accept the impact. And I know examples where, if we had done it properly, we could have done it differently and better. Mm. And there has to be a willingness also for engineers, for example, to engage with ecologists and understand, no, that is actually a no-go. We can do it better. We do need to all compromise in this regard, because it's, what can I say? There are some deal breakers with regard to what we lose with the transition, despite the fact that we all want the result. Yeah. So we need to make sure that is also figured in, and that goes to the community benefit sharing, et cetera, et cetera. And that's also about benefits for the environment.
Grumpy Bear.
Yeah.
Just simmering over there.
No, I'm fine. I mean, this is fantastic. They can keep going if you'd like them to. So I spoke yesterday. I'm fine.
This might be a short intervention from Grumpy Bear, but because the built environment, it's super simple, right? We've got all the technology. Okay. Why are you even here? Shouldn't you be installing a heat pump?
Yeah, exactly. It's why do we this is the thing we keep telling people. The built environment's has the easiest job because we've given infinite money and infinite people. We could solve it tomorrow. Literally. There's nothing technologically that stops us. Small problem. There's 9 million of them in Australia alone. Right, that's how many buildings there are, give or take, and that's a problem because the challenge is wildly different. We're not trying to figure out how do we make the grid work better, or change transportation, or decarbonize steel, or all of the actual genuine problems that exist. Everyone knows what an LED light is. We all like houses that are more comfortable. That's not a problem. And to be honest, I think as more people start cooking with induction cooktops, everyone goes, wow, this is great. But there's 9 million of them. And that's a lot. And we can't, we use this stat, and we've used it several times when we're talking around what policies we should do. And I want to reflect a little bit on what you said, Heidi, as well, which is, we sometimes obfuscate the problem a bit too much in buildings. If I tell you what everyone needs to do is to do a whole life carbon assessment of their building to identify which measures they should introduce to be able to reduce their emissions across the entire life cycle of the building between the construction and the end of life. First of all, no one knows what the hell I'm talking about. Second of all, no one knows what to do. If I go and say, can you just please change your light bulbs and change your gas cooktop to all electric, that's easy. And that's like 50% of the problem, right? And so we need to stop kind of giving the impression in some cases that there's a myriad of solutions when actually some of the solutions are really simple and basic. Now, second problem, of course, let's just take electrification. There are about 6 million gas connections to buildings, houses, units in Australia. And we look at 25 years. So let's assume somehow, right, that we could take a 25-year line and we draw a straight line between now and 2050. And we start electrifying houses, right, every day. That's about 1,000 houses a day. Let's say it's 800, but like who's counting, right? Because we're building new houses and all that stuff. It's 1,000 houses a day. At some point, halfway through, we have to keep running the gas network for half the houses we have. Who's paying for that cost? We have a problem. And so now the question of just transitions enters the conversation. How do we actually make it so that people who are going to be the most impacted by the decision of having to change the house to be more energy efficient, to electrify the house, and to do it in a way where, to be honest, for a lot of people, the house they have kind of works well enough, so it's just an extra expense that they really don't want to have to deal with. How do we solve for those problems? How do we solve for social housing? How do we solve for areas that really haven't, they just bought a house. It's an expensive thing to go and electrify a house. In some cases, for older houses, it can be a significant amount of money. And there's not even going to apartments, which once you add strata and you add a whole heap of other things, you got into a lot of problems. So the challenge is just different. It's not a technology problem. It's a community problem.
I get really nervous about the hard to abate terminology because it implies that the other sectors are easy to abate. And it's true that we've got the technology in buildings, but like the things that we need to spin up in terms of the dollars,
the electricians,
the deployment pathways, so the trusted providers that can actually do all of that work. And then the thing that you hit on, which I was really glad you talked to, the demand, like people actually wanting this stuff. Like people have to want it.
And we end up in a situation where people might go and say, well, now we're talking to an appliance manufacturer and they're like, oh yeah, we're seeing like growth in the induction cooktop space. And we're like, great. So now we're in a situation where because there's no actual organized policy setting to say, hey, we need to electrify houses, everyone's just going to randomly do it. So now we have the worst of both worlds where we have a disorganized transition in houses around these things, right? We have to keep the entire gas network running on the off chance that any random person may not actually do that. And at some point, you're going to have to say, well, you have 5 years, and now we have who knows how many houses to electrify. These are genuine problems that require good policy direction and good policy signals. And that's the challenge, right? Like that's the bit where we go, how do you solve for this? And it would be easier if all we were doing was we're just going to do it for the things we have now. You add the fact that the built environment will be twice as big in 2050 and the policy settings are still not right to make sure that all of those houses we're going to build now between now and 2050 are in line with what we know we need to do today, which is crazy. Like it is objectively bananas. That's why I'm grumpy bear. But you end up in situations where you have an South Australian government saying, hey, maybe what if we don't update building regulations for the next 10 years? That's a problem. We have situations where there's been enough noise about what if we just delay the implementation of the code that we agreed 2 years ago, much less the code that we need to build. And we haven't even spoken about the construction impacts and so on, which are significant, and we still need to deal with. But buildings are probably out of all of the sectors the stranger one. It has a lot of emissions, right? It's a big emission sector collectively, but individually, it's nothing. An individual building is nothing in terms of emissions, but we have to do all of them, and we have to do them really quickly, like really, really quickly. And arguably quicker than the other sectors because that could buy time for other sectors to decarbonize as well.
So, Andrew, I understand that you're here to announce the Australian government's sector decarbonisation plan, including a funding package for transport. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we're not quite at that stage yet, and possibly career limiting to get ahead of the minister. So probably won't be able to do that one today. But I can give you an update, perhaps.
That would be great.
So, first of all, really privileged to be part of this conversation and hearing about the complexities from all these different perspectives, because what the government through its sector plans framework has been doing is looking at how do we develop 6 sectoral plans. And just at its starting point, as a policy bureaucrat, it is a different way of working, because the work that we're doing in the transport sector plan actually was announced ahead of the sector plans framework. And when we were doing that, we thought, this is great. We're really doing something that is going to have massive impact. And we're starting this conversation, but we had a lot of air to have that conversation. Suddenly we're doing it across 6 sector plans, and it's absolutely critical that it happens that way. But it makes both the complexity kind of amplify, but the opportunity amplify as well. And that requires us to not think in portfolios and stovepipes and all those things, and actually go, what are we trying to achieve? And well, my scope 1 and your scope 3 might kind of merge together here, and it doesn't matter which sector that gets the 10 points for the reduction. We actually just need it all to happen in the most speedy but economically sound way.
I like that. It's like 10 points for Gryffindor. It could be 10 points for industry.
But that's the race we're in, right?
Yeah.
And we are absolutely looking at, well, how do we reduce emissions? And the levers that I have in my portfolio actually will help reduce the resources sector if we use our transport infrastructure program to create demand for low emissions materials. So that's just a different way of us beginning to think about the problems. And we have these discussions across departments when we're developing these sector plans. We have these discussions with states and territories, and both through the Energy and Climate Change Ministers Council, and for my portfolio, the Infrastructure Transport Ministers meeting. We have layers upon layers of these discussions. But for the transport sector plan itself, we were able to release what we called our consultation roadmap in, I think it was May this year. And that was a really critical moment for us to get something into a public discussion, because my team had been working on this for a long time. And it does focus on the tech pathways, because that's the starting point, and it's also the easiest part. So we've gone through, we've laid out what all the best evidence, information, and inputs that we've received. So this was what looks to be the right tech pathways, and what the role of individual transport modes and enabling systems to look like in our economy. And then what it looks like to reduce emissions until 2030, until 2040, and to 2050. Again, this is a fundamentally different way of thinking about how we do policy. And now it's in that cycle. So we've gone out, we've done a big consultation. We received hundreds of submissions. We did public engagement. We had 170 participants just at our online information sessions. And that was really interesting to see the breadth of the community who wanted to talk about this problem from different perspectives. And then we also leaned in parts of the transport system which hadn't been part of a decarbonisation discussion previously. So, for instance, we didn't go and do a lot of discussions on light vehicles, because there's a really clear pathway, and the government's new vehicle efficiency standard to really reduce emissions through a regulatory setting means that isn't the unknown. The complexity, we don't like to say hard to abate, but we do say hard to electrify, and that's when you get into heavy transport and you're looking at your rail, your heavy vehicles, maritime, and your transport system. So what are the energy needs of transport, and how do we rethink that? And what we came through in our process for looking at what we could do is we could look at, and our consultation roadmap does this, individual transport modes and enabling systems. But the first thing that we have to do is actually start with the outcome of what our transport system's here to do, and that's about the movement of people and movement of freight. And if we can't have conversations at that level, we're actually not going to get to a step change here, because my particular branch in my department is called Net Zero Unit. We work across the whole of the department, and there are individual teams looking within transport modes. And so I say, look, if we stopped today, there would be a continual downward pressure on transport emissions, but that's not why we're here. We're here to look at what are those opportunities across the whole of the system, and how do we look at linking to what might be coming forward under the Future Made in Australia agenda, and contributing to other sector plans, and the massive renewable energy build out, because in order to build some of that renewable energy, you need transport systems to support it. And that's really complex. And I'll probably finish on kind of the general observation that I often make is 12 months ago, most conversations I had with people would end in sustainable aviation fuel. And that's not where we are now. There's a clear pathway. The government's announced that its intent to kickstart a domestic low carbon liquid fuel industry is part of its Future Made in Australia agenda. The tech is clear, the investment is important, and that's still a significant challenge, but that pathway is understandable. The pathway that people now struggle with is coming back to planning and integrated systems here of, well, actually, how are we planning for the cities and the regions that we need into the future? And that's going to be the difficult part for me, because it's really easy to look at what do we do today to reduce tailpipe emissions. It's really hard to say, what do we need to start setting up in our systems and thinkings? Because you're right, things exist now. We're not starting from scratch. But what can we do that helps us make decisions in the next 5 years that set us up for the next 20 years? And how do we make those changes stick?
One of the things that regularly comes up when I talk to friends whose their bread and butter is advocacy around emissions reduction in transport, and they don't have any particular dog in the fight. Just from a first principles perspective, they regard the debate in Australia as being like playing a lot of catch up on electrification, particularly of passenger vehicles, and nowhere near enough conversation around mode shift and public transport and the role of that. Is that something that's come through your feedback, and how are you thinking about that?
Absolutely. So I will do the good government acknowledgement that in the budget, the government did announce $100 million for active transport. That's deeply uncomfortable for a government that has a long history of building roads, and there's always been available programs to support those sort of things. But at a federal level, we have part of the role. We have to work very closely with states and territories on active and particularly public transport because of the opportunities it provides through our work with infrastructure and transport ministers across all jurisdictions. We have our decarbonisation of transport working groups where active and public transport are part of the priorities that we work to. The question that we have to be mindful of is, at the federal level, what's the role of the Commonwealth government versus states versus local government, and how do we have all of those systems working together? And I can tell you that the way that some of our funding programs work, because the Commonwealth builds infrastructure of national significance as first principles, is we look at things connected to a road, and so we can do active transport that's connected to a road. That's not serving the full needs of the community. It will be really good for commuter cyclists, but it's not going to change behaviours and make things easy and attractive for people to say, actually, I don't need a car. And there's been some great work about the role that electric buses can play in shifting the dial and reducing the needs for private vehicle use. I like to say mode choice, because mode shift implies that a government is going to direct an outcome. And we're talking a lot today that everyone has a role here, and we need to make people's options increase and understand the impact of their options. And where we can, we're absolutely conscious of the ways in which public and active transport offer a solution. But the only counter I'd say to that is there's not enough evidence about the potential emissions that can be directly achieved in Australia, because people look to European examples, and that's great. But Australian cities have been built in around cars and car use, and as part of an identity, we don't have as much ability to turn off that kind of view that cars are our primary way to move around. And so it's a much more significant change if we are really going to encourage active and public transport as a primary way of moving, particularly in cities. I'm someone who didn't own a car until very recently, so I'm really all for that. But I think that's the challenge of no two places are the same. And when we think about what's important in the Australian context, that our cities that are based around cars need to fundamentally change to reduce the reliance on cars, and that involves all levels of government working together.
I'm going to go to the floor in a moment for questions, so just do a bit of rumination. But just this is one for the entire panel, and anyone can jump in. As an advocate, having really been one of the people pushing the federal government to do these sectoral decarbonisation plans, it's been really fascinating living through this process of going into the detail of the particular decarbonisation pathways in particular sectors, working with departments, working with the CCA, working with the government on all of that. But then just it brings you inevitably back up to the interconnections. And I think you've all spoken to that. Obviously, decarbonisation of the electricity system is just this massive enabler for so many other things across all of the sectors. But there's also relationships between, the production of low carbon or zero carbon building products that allow us to fix all the buildings, the competing land uses, where you talk about renewable rollout or abatement opportunities through land-based offsets, all those sorts of things, sustainable aviation fuel, all these sort of things kind of just crash into each other fairly quickly. Do any of you have anything that you would like to share in terms of those interactions between the sectors?
Why, Luke, we have given that some thought. So for Beyond Zero Emissions, I'll talk about tech because that is what we focus on. So the things that we make in these industrial clusters need to actually be relevant to our domestic needs, as well as providing us with export opportunities. So for us, the 9 million buildings that all need increasing amounts of active comfort as well. Active comfort is what you call an air conditioner. So I'm a recovering architect and come up in a sort of school of the 1970s, passive design things. So I went to uni and we were doing rules of thumb around how much thermal mass, what types of, materials density could you have on your floor and your walls so the sun hit it at the right point in winter and you could... And what I was doing was working alongside some of those solar architects of the 70s and retrofitting air conditioners in, because even by the late 90s, our weather patterns had shifted enough that we were actually getting some of those extreme weather events outside of what we call the shading season. So the need for the need to be able to turn on air conditioning is going to be incredibly important across that building stock that otherwise maybe we had other options at some point, but today we don't. So what if you need to make millions of heat pumps? What if we need to install millions, billions of solar panels, wind turbines, batteries in our electric vehicles, especially commercial electric vehicles, and we need to pair them up with depots that can actually manage some of that energy storage to make it available not only for the fleet but for other things as well. So Beyond Zero Emissions, we just, practical, we went, okay, let's quantify what's needed across 5 critical technologies that are relevant across the sectors here. And what happens if we take each of those and we try to make some of it here? What would we make here? Where would we intervene in those supply chains if those supply chains were genuinely circular? So this is where we don't want to junk, millions of bits of equipment for no good reason. We actually need to be able to have a strong manufacturing sector onshore in Australia, big enough that we can deal with the post-consumer products that are coming out of buildings, out of cars, out of our infrastructure kit as well. We need to be able to process that here, enough of it, so that we don't just become first a quarry and then a tip for the world's products and our own. You got some ideas about that as well. So the answer is 30 to 40% of the rollout we could make here at different points in the supply chain across those critical technologies. Our website, the first report is deploy, that quantifies what's needed, and make it here will tell you how much and what parts of the supply chain to intervene in for each of those 5.
I did. Amanda's going to follow me.
Yeah, I'm going to be calling her Funshine Bear for the rest of her life.
But I think just to add a little bit to what you were saying, right, which is if we just think about one thing, the importance of us thinking about what are the technologies and like linkages that we need here, and buildings are a really good example of like an entity that again collectively uses or emits a lot of carbon. But in and of itself, most of the carbon is coming in from a demand perspective, right? It's energy. Like buildings will need to use energy no matter what. But if the grid's decarbonized, the problem in theory is solved. We just need not to use a lot, right? Like that's a specific thing. But the other thing is refrigerants is a good example of that in buildings. Again, well, let's assume we're going to install a few, like 10 million heat pumps just for funsies, right? So Europe gets heat pumps that have natural refrigerants, global warming potential of about 1. Australia gets heat pumps with a global warming potential, with refrigerants have a global warming potential of about like 700, right? So that's a big difference. Why? Because we don't have a regulation that says you need to have that. But we could build them here. Like this is not, they're not new technology. They're 1970s technology. Your fridge is a heat pump, right? Like we know how to do this stuff. And that's really valuable. Like the opportunity that the sectorial pathways give us is to identify these linkages. And I think that's really powerful.
Yes, please, my turn.
Yes.
I'll be verbose, Bear. So just a big thank you for the joined up government whole of system discussion. Just so fundamentally important. So just a hats off that people are trying to do that, even if it must explode your brain. Can't see any sign of that, by the way, just saying. Next one, circular economy. Thank you. So once again, we're in the environment. All of this happens in the environment, what we take out, what goes back in. So it's just great to have that in the picture. Don't have anything to follow up from your comment, but
okay.
so moving on to mine, though.
But I like you.
Even though you're grumpy.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. Okay.
Still polite, Bear.
Polite and grumpy.
Yeah, and grumpy Bear.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay, that's
I feel
good.
like I'm losing control of this franchise.
Yeah, no, you are.
Oh, that
You
ship
totally
sailed,
are.
look.
So now my actual point.
This is not, let me sum up here.
But I do think all of this fits within this idea of understanding the circular economy, Earth as a spaceship, and also that integrated nature. So from my perspective, what becomes really important in that is two issues about your question in a sense. One thing that is also not new is this idea of multiple use, out on country. Yep. In the rangelands, for example, lots of stuff that's been done in multiple use of land. So multiple outcomes is something we can do that we're not seeing written up in work. So nature-based solutions are a classic example. Nature-based solutions that can actually benefit people, benefit resilience for infrastructure, benefit the environment, benefit for sequestration, and by the way, maybe do a bit of adaptation along the way. So there's this issue too of us being smart enough when we get out of our silos to say, where is it that we can actually leverage, and this goes to your point about step change, where can we leverage all of these necessary outcomes and the efforts we're putting in to get that step change? And so nature-based solutions to me are just a wonderful example of that we're not leaning into sufficiently. And part of why we're not leaning into it is sometimes who we have at the table and who we don't have at the table with having these conversations and determining things. The second point of that, which I find endlessly fascinating, particularly when I go and talk to people about and they use the term in the CCA report, land-based removals, which I thought was an interesting one. So I'll just adopt that for now, land-based removals. So let's say, climate mitigation or sequestration. People aren't talking about the fact that the very reason we're doing this, climate change, is the very thing that's going to be the major disruptor to anything that we do, and that's the case with land-based removals, for example. So this magic pudding where every sector is going, oh, that's all right, we'll get, we'll figure that out because the land-based sector will deal with that for us, however many times over. And by the way, produce some renewable fuels and a few other things as well and keep us, clothed, etc. We're not thinking across the system, including in infrastructure, speaking as someone in a region that, the potholes that keep on needing to be filled because of the extreme events. We're not thinking about that step change that is required with regards to managing the risk that we have ahead coming from the very thing that we're trying to actually do something about. And that's the thing that really worries me in the conversations that I have, sometimes on a sectoral basis or a very specific basis, but sometimes across the whole. And climate as a disruptor that we need to manage across a whole of system because of the feedback loops and the knock-on effects that happen, and transportation is just one example, is for me something that we need to be taking into account in all of this conversation. So the national climate risk assessment work, the climate adaptation work, all of that has to be also entirely wrapped into this. Otherwise, I fear that, we'll be bears sailing off into the sunset, but the sunset's not going to last that long.
Bears on a raft now is where we've landed.
Bears on a raft without a paddle.
There you go. Okay.
You'll have to make it more positive now, Luke.
I have more questions, but I promised you the opportunity to ask questions yourselves. So is there anyone out in the audience? We've got a hand here and then a hand here. Just up the front first, please. Sorry. Thank you. And if you can introduce yourself, that would be great.
Thank you. It's been a fascinating conversation so far. Thank you, panellists. My name's Susan McCatty. My question today is, it feels like we've come to the pathways and the plans. Finally, it's great to be here. The work's happening very quickly. It's great to hear how interconnected it is in your experience of leading it, Andrew, in the role that you have. Has anybody had a chance to think about what we do once they're published? What's the ongoing governance of this planning system that we've designed? How do we all contribute? And how do we keep it kind of current and meaningful?
I think that is a good one for you. What I will say is just my observation, having talked to a lot of the people that are in the process, is that it's very clear that this is a point in time and that it's necessarily going to need to be iterated. Like if this is a snapshot and sits on a shelf, then it won't be a success. It's got to evolve, right?
Completely agree. So in terms of the formal governance of what next, a lot of that hasn't been decided and announced. I think the things that we know is that the CCA has its formal annual reporting to do. And that's a really powerful mechanism because it's independent and it's public. And we really want to make sure that we get behind that and recognise its role in the system. In terms of what I often say to my team is we'll get new policy in the next 6 months and then the 6 months after that and the 6 months after that. That's fine and that will be good. What's going to be great though is if we can do it in a way that also delivers public accountability mechanisms that make these changes stick. And that's probably not going to be one thing. Like I can point to the CCA and say that's a really important part of the puzzle. And there's probably going to need to be other things here as well. And just going back to this whole conversation of how do we make it clear and understandable so that we maintain social license for this change? Because it's complex. And I work in this space day to day and I find it complex. And I'm lucky that it's the main thing I have to worry about. You add that into everyone's life and how do we maintain support for it? And I think that accountability and public discussion of it in a simple way is going to be critical.
If you live in a suburb in Australia, you live in a house, built environment sector plan that's powered by the energy system, energy sector plan, you work in a manufacturing facility, you're suddenly in the industry sector plan that you drive to, which is the transport sector plan, right? Like in terms of that communication task, there's a lot there.
And you buy dinner, therefore the egg.
Thank you, Kate. We had a question just here, I think, or here. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then
Ray Minicon, Indigenous Peoples Organisation. Look, I just feel a little discriminated against here today in this conversation because we do have, as Indigenous peoples, we have to abide by the Native Title Act, which has within it Indigenous land use agreements. And everything that you guys have been talking about today, we have to abide by in order to make our native title legal and registered. And as Kathryn has talked about here about a framework and mechanisms, I think that's the mechanism that you could possibly look at in terms of a legal framework to make an impact upon the climate crisis that we have in this country here. Because the Native Title Act gives us huge, big flexibilities in the ways in which we negotiate how land is used and protected and then put under a legal registration so that nobody can touch it. And so I think we need to start talking about those kind of frameworks, an Indigenous land use agreement or an Australian land use agreements that brings everybody to the table and actually solves some of the challenges that you're talking about today. Thank you.
That's a great comment. Did you want to speak to that?
Can I just say yes? I think this is where it's really interesting that people forget that 50% at least of Australia is Indigenous lands, including Indigenous land use agreements or native title or Indigenous owned, etc. So I agree that that's a foundation. I also think there's a whole bunch of pretty fundamental moral and legal issues around that. And I just would like to go back to the point that was made once again from a question last session, which is we want to be shareholders, not stakeholders. So just to reiterate how important all of those processes are, the frameworks we have, but who gets to be at the table, and everyone having agency in that role. Yeah.
So can I ask, there's been a big process around the First Nations clean energy strategy. I don't know if you've been involved or interacted with that, but do you feel like some of the work that's being done through that work stream is beginning to address some of your concerns in that space?
Not enough and very slow.
Yeah.
Can I also say too, I think there's a point that was made this morning, and was it Simon who mentioned the Western Green Energy Hub? I think this is also one of the reframings we've been trying to make too with regional Australia, is there's an opportunity here, not just a threat or the risk. And so making sure those frameworks are there for people to be able to lead that opportunity and determine that opportunity, I think is really, really important. And the more we have examples of that can actually lead the way for the rest, I think that's really fantastic.
We're almost out of time. I wanted to read you a couple of sentences that jumped out at me from the CCA paper last week, which I think kind of encapsulate a lot of the things we've been talking about today, and just get a quick 10 or 20 second reaction about what this means for you. The transition to net zero involves much more than each sector moving along technology-based decarbonisation pathways. A zero carbon mindset must become the new normal so that it permeates operational policy and investment and purchasing decisions across governments, businesses and households. I'm just interested in closing with hearing from each of you on what a net zero carbon mindset means to you.
Thinking about this in terms of net zero is a pathway to catastrophe. You actually need to be talking and planning for a future where we are not polluting first and then trying to make up for it later. So as hard as it is to address the challenges that are in front of us right now, we don't actually win long-term for future generations unless we are actively looking for zero emissions. So those charts that talk about the land sector, sucking up 2 degrees worth of global warming, worth of emissions, that's not a win, folks. This is a step along the way, but we really need to be talking real zero.
I think I go back to a comment that was made that I'm probably paraphrasing, but a few years back. But essentially, we're now at a point where when you look at the sectoral pathways and you look at the amount of work required, the fact is that now every job is a climate job and every job is a nature job. That's really important. And that's really a key thing that we need to somehow express to people, right? Every decision that we're making right now is having an impact on those two sectors and more, to be fair, but articulating it that clearly and making everyone be part of that same mindset, I think is part of what's needed for the sectoral pathways to be.
Eventually, it's not the clean economy, it's just the economy.
It's just the economy, right? Like we had this conversation a lot around sustainable finance, and we're talking to the banks about it, and they're like, yeah, I want to put it in sustainable finance. And we're like, it could just be finance. You could just have like standards that are, won't invest in terrible things. You don't need to call that sustainable finance. Just, it's just money. Just don't invest in those things. It's fine. And I think that's important.
Kate?
Okay, ornery bear. Does it have to be a singular mindset? Like, I think the whole thing that drives us forward are the conversations where we have multiple mindsets and we aren't assuming that there is one. Sorry to be so pedantic about it.
That's why there's multiple care bears.
Yeah, exactly. So for me, it is more than a mindset. Also, the other thing that goes back to today is I think scale is really important. So when we talk about mindset, if we say Australia-wide, that's where we can end up with that lack of justice, either in a place or for particular people, because we're looking at it. It's like a GDP figure, that's not good enough. We have to be able to manage between those scales of understanding, how we have it as a national mindset or series of mindsets, but how we manage to actually get that granular detail to know what this actually translates for the people on the ground and for that part of the environment. So I'm just sort of being conscious too that we can oversimplify in a way that is very damaging.
Andrew?
Look, I think all of that sounds eminently sensible. One of the things that I've observed is, particularly as we're looking at that concept of net zero by timelines, going, oh, well, I first need to know what the emissions were in 2003 so that I can do the maths and make sure we're on track. And that's one mindset that's important. But we also need to have the same mindset next to it, which is any reduction of emissions is important, and we should be taking all of the ones that we can. And so the way that it's expressed in the CCA report makes sense. I think our role, particularly my role in government, is about making that information available to people so that they have the ability to make choices and deliver a zero carbon mindset where they can.
Andrew, Kate, Jorge, Heidi, you've been great Care Bears. Please put your hands together for our panel.
Thanks, Luke. Oh, thank you, Luke. I really appreciate that. Especially appreciate you running to time. Well done. That was so good. Absolutely incredible.
Do what I can.
Any other people who've got a panel coming up, focus on what Luke did, landing us on time. That way we can all get out on time at the end of the day. Have you got that? Good. Okay. Look, it is lunchtime, but there are a few changes to some venues for the other sessions coming up after lunch. So, repowering our homes and communities, that's going to be in the Media Tech, moderated by Katie Hepworth from the Electrical Trades Unions. Clean Industries, Manufacturing and Exports, that's now in the Theaterette, moderated by Monica Richter from WWF. And Nature and Land Use Trade-Offs, that's going to be in the Gallery, moderated by Tracy Armstrong from Climate Works Centre. So there's going to be some great discussions and actionable insights from that one. Also, if you identify as Pacifica or First Nations, there's a special lunch space set up in the courtyard for you. And do go and grab a copy of Lee Constable's book. She's signing it. If you've got a young person in your life who's like 8, 9, 10, 11, it's the perfect demo to give a book about climate change to someone. So, yeah, it's an excellent book. I gave one to a family friend of mine, and she called me up yesterday and to say, "Hi, Dan, I read that book and I gave a speech at school and I won the prize for best speech." So she's from reading Lee Constable's book. So do that. Right now, it's lunchtime.